Okay, Rabbi, so let's begin. Yesterday, we saw in the Mishnah machlokas between the Chachamim and Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel as to what you do when a slave, an Eved Kanani, is taken into captivity. He's captured, and there's a desire to ransom him back. And another Jew, like Reuven, owns the slave. Shimon goes ahead and ransoms him. So the question is, does this fellow remain a slave or not? And if he does remain a slave, then who does he belong to, Reuven or Shimon? So the Tanakama says that it depends. If Shimon ransomed him for the sake of being free, so then he goes free. If Shimon ransomed him for the sake of being a slave, then he becomes a slave. Now there's two ways of understanding that. The one is according to Abaye, and one is according to Rava. According to Abaye, we're talking about a case where the owner has not had yeush yet. He has not relinquished ownership. So there's no way for that slave to really go free. And therefore, if Shimon ransoms him for the sake of being an Eved, he remains an Eved of Reuven, doesn't become an Eved of Shimon. Why then does he go free if Shimon ransomed him for the sake of going free? The answer is, according to Abaye, because we want to create an incentive for Pidyon Shvuyim. Because according to the Chachamim, the mitzvah of Pidyon Shvuyim only applies to Jews and not to Avadim Kenanim and not to servants. And therefore, this guy will never be saved. So therefore, the Chachamim made a takana that if the whole reason that Shimon wants to redeem him is because he's going to be a free man, so we make him free in order to allow him to be redeemed. According to Rava, there's a whole different way of learning the Mishnah. We're talking about where the owner already had Yeush and has relinquished ownership. So if Shimon goes ahead and redeems him, so then if he redeems him for the sake of being a free man, so the slave is a free man because Reuven has relinquished ownership and Shimon doesn't want him either. But if Shimon redeems him for the sake of being a slave, so then Shimon ends up acquiring the slave for himself from his Gentile captors, since Reuven has already given up hope of ever retrieving him. So those are the two ways of understanding the Chachamim. Now, in both, whether you learn like Abaye or Rava, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel in our Mishnah disagrees, and he says that no, regardless of what Shimon's intentions are, the Eved always remains an Eved. Now, we gave our explanation yesterday, but in order not to get bogged down, we'll come back, we'll revisit that shortly. The question at hand now is, that we were dealing with yesterday, is how, according to Rava, that Shimon, the Redeemer, becomes the new owner of the slave. How did he acquire him as a slave? What mechanism was there? If Reuven already made him Hefker, because he had Yeush, so how do you, turn someone into an Eved? That Shimon can now make him into an Eved. The Gemara answered that the captors acquired this Eved Kanani as a slave. And so they have the right, therefore, to transfer ownership from their possession of the slave over to Shimon. The only thing that the Gemara had said was with one caveat. The captors do not own the body of the slave. They only own the Maaseh Yadayim. They only own him for the sake of his handiwork, what we would call an indentured servant, not an actual slave. And therefore, that's all that Shimon owns as far as the rights of this fellow's labor, but it does not consider him an actual possession. There could be a number of nafkaminas. One nafkamina would be that if Shimon dies, it doesn't get passed on as an inheritance to his children because it's not his bodily possession. But in any event, that's where we're up to. And the Gemara had said that we learn from the fact that a Gentile can own a Jew for his Maaseh Yadayim, then surely a Gentile captor can own an Eved Kanani for his Maaseh Yadayim. So the Gemara now says, Ve'ema. We're up to that word, Ve'ema, hani mili bekaspa. So the Gemara is really continuing. It's the 7th line of the Gemara. Really, our question is like this. Maybe the only way that a Gentile can acquire another Gentile as a slave or as an indentured servant is only through the transfer of cash. Because after all, our source text is based on the fact that a Gentile can acquire a Jew as is an indentured servant, but there the Torah says kinyan kaspa. It says that the Gentile pays money. But over here, the captors didn't pay money, aval b'chazak alo. Where do you see that just because they take possession of this person and demonstrate that they are his masters, that is enough to be considered the owner of the slave? Amar Rav Papa, Amanu Moav Tiharu B'Sichon. So Rav Papa answers by saying, very simply, we have a precedent for this in the Torah. If we can prove by real estate that even if a Gentile doesn't pay cash for that real estate but just demonstrates ownership, that makes him the new owner, we could transfer that argument to slaves as well, because the idea is that real estate and avadim are connected as far as the methodology of kinyan. So Rav Papa says, we know that when the Jewish people were traveling towards Eretz Yisrael, and they were traveling through the Transjordan, they were able to take possession of the Sichon territory after making war with Sichon and the Amorites. What gave them the right to do that? After all, the Amorites were living on the property that had previously belonged to Ammon and Moab. And Hashem had told the Jewish people, Al Totzar es Moab. You have no right to dispossess the Moabites of their property because they're your kin. So the answer is that because Sichon had usurped the property from Ammon and Moab, this now made it that it belonged to Sichon. It did not, of the Amorites, it no longer belonged to Ammon and Moab. And this is what gave the Jewish people the right to take it from Sichon, because they weren't taking it from Moab. So what you see from here is that through an act of war, or through an act of coercion, as long as a person demonstrates bailus, as long as a person demonstrates that he is the new master of the property, that's enough for it to be considered for him to make a kinyan. So the same thing can be argued by the slave. If the captors take possession of the slave, they become now the new owners, and that's what right they have to transfer ownership to a Jew. So Ashkechan Obe Kochavim Obe Kochavim. Obe Kochavim Yisrael Minola. So the way that Rashi learns this question, that only shows you that when an Oved Kochavim belongs to an Oved Kochavim, that when a Gentile belongs to a Gentile, or like property you can take from a Gentile, right? But how do you know that when a Gentile is the possession of a Yisrael, you can take forcibly that possession from the Jew and make it your own if you're a Gentile just through the act of chazakah? So the Gemara answers, Dichsiv vayishp mimenu shevi, because the Torah says in Parshas Chukas that when the Canaani went out to war against the Jewish people, they were able to take a captive for themselves. And that implies that a Jew, or some argue Rashi says that it was a Shifcha Canaanis that belonged to the Jew, but something that is either a Jew or the possession of a Jew can be forcibly taken by a Gentile, and that forced taking, which demonstrates new ownership, is in itself the method of kinyan from the Yisrael to the Gentile. Okay, so therefore we've answered the question as to how the mechanism works to allow Shimon, the Redeemer, to take possession of the Eved Kanani if you learn like Rava that everything happened after Yesh. Now let's go on. Amar of Shaman bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Eved sheborach mi beiso asurim yotza lecherus. V'lo od ela shekofenes rabba v'kosav lo get shichur. So Rav Shaman bar Abba says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that if an Eved Kanani is captured by captors and then he runs away, so the halacha is that he immediately goes free. He immediately goes free. And not only that, but we coerce the former master Ruvain to write him a get shichur to demonstrate that he's a free man. So Tanan, now let's look at our Mishnah. Let's see if that fits with our Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel oimer bein kach uvein kach yishtabed. So we know in our Mishnah that Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says that regardless of Shimon's intentions when he redeems the Eved Kanani from the captors, the Eved Kanani always remains a slave. So that seems to contradict Rabbi Yochanan. And furthermore, V'Amar Rabba bar Barchana Amar Rabbi Yochanan Kol Makom Sheshana Rabbi Shimon Gamliel b'Mishnah Seinu Halacha Kamoso Chutz Me Arev V'Tzidon V'Raya Achrona. That every single place where Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel is cited in a Mishnah, we paskin like Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, except for three halachos called Arev, Tzidon, and Raya Achrona, which we're not going to go through now. But those are the three exceptions to the rule. The point that we're trying to make is that how can the same Rabbi Yochanan say that when the Eved escapes, he becomes free, when Rabbi Yochanan always paskins like Rav Shimon Gamliel, who says that no matter what, an Eved that is captured remains an Eved. So the Gemara says, Bishlam alei Abaya muki lo lahai lifnei yeyush v'hai la'achar yeyush. So I could answer according to Abai. Remember, there was machlokas between Abai and Rava in how to interpret our Mishnah. According to Abaya, the reason why the Eved remains an Eved is because the owner has not yet relinquished ownership of him. That's what our Mishnah is talking about. And therefore, you could say that when Rabbi Yochanan said that when the Eved escapes, he goes free, is because that's talking about where the owner already had Yeyush, he relinquished ownership. So that's not a contradiction. Ela l'Rava, or Rabba, whatever your goris, the Omer la'achar Yeyush kasha. But according to Rava, who says that our Mishnah too is talking about even when the owner has relinquished his rights to the Eved, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel paskins that the Eved always remains an Eved. Now, do you remember the reason why, according to Rava, why the Eved always remains an Eved? It's because of a principle that Chizkiah had laid down. Chizkiah said the Eved always remains an Eved because if we would suggest that the Eved goes free after being captured, then every Eved Kanani would want to hire someone to capture him, so that this would be a pretense for him to be able to go free from his master. So therefore, there's like a knas that we place upon any Eved Kanani who's captured, that no matter how he is released, he still remains an Eved Kanani. So the Gemara says, the Rabbi Yochanan ad Rabbi Yochanan, so kasha the Rabbi Yochanan ad Rabbi Yochanan, so therefore it's a kasha. According to Rava's interpretation of the Mishnah, we have a direct contradiction in Rabbi Yochanan. So Amr lacha Rava taimamai mishum dechizkiya boreach shayni hashad lekatala maser nafshe afuli afil nafshe legayasos ? Question mark, exclamation point. In other words, the Gemara's point is like this. What was the whole rationale of Chizkiya's argument? We penalize an Eved Kanani so that he will not feel this desire to go ahead and hire someone or let himself be captured, right? Because he figures this will be a way for him to go free. But look at what this guy is doing. He's been captured, and now he's escaping by digging a tunnel out of the jail that he's being held in and running away. Now he knows that any time, if you're in the kidnapping business, if you catch someone trying to break out of the prison that you made for them, you're going to get executed. So this guy is obviously risking his life so desperately he wants to get away from these people. That's a sign that this is not a person who voluntarily submitted himself for capture. It's like saying, if a guy tries to run away from ISIS, that's a pretty good indication that he didn't want to be there in the first place. Not always, but it's a pretty good indication that he didn't want to be there in the first place. And therefore, the whole argument of Chizkiah as why we should penalize a person to make him a slave doesn't really apply in this case. And therefore, even Rav Shimon Gamliel would agree, argues Rabbi Yochanan, that in a situation like this, where the owner has already had Yeyush, the Eved is going to go free. It actually got warmer in here, Noel. Thank you. Thank you very much. It did get warmer in here.
It's drying a lot of times, that's right.
Okay. Next. Amasei de Mar Shmuel ishtaboy. Now the Gemara tells us a story. The Shivcha Kenanis, the servant of Mar Shmuel, was taken captive. Parkua lushum amhasa v'shadru halei. So Mar Shmuel's friends went ahead and ransomed her, okay, and they sent her back via proxy to Mar Shmuel, telling him as follows: Sholchule anan ke Rabbi Shimon Gamliel sviralan. First of all, they said, we paskin like Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, who says that even if a second person ransoms the Eved remains an Eved. And it doesn't matter what the intentions of the person were. At inami kirabanan sviralach anan l'shum amhasa parkin la nihala. So, and therefore, even if you, Mar Shmuel, paskin like the Chachamim, who say that if Shimon ransoms the Eved for the sake of being free, then the person goes free, but you should realize that we did not ransom her for the sake of her going free. We ransomed her for the sake of giving her back to you as an Eved. And therefore, she is rightfully yours, and you have a right to keep her as your shivcha. So v'inhu savar lifnei yeyoshava v'lohi la'achar yeyoshava u'shmuel lo mibayad la'achar yeyoshava. Period. But the mistake that Shmuel's friends made was that they thought that Shmuel had not yet had Yeush. And therefore they were learning the Mishnah like Abaye, who says that if Shimon ransoms the girl, or ransoms the Eved, for the sake of him becoming an Eved, he goes back to Ruvain, the original master, because the master didn't yet have Yeush. But that's not true, since Shmuel already had Yeush. Shmuel paskined that the Mishnah does not apply in that case, and therefore the Shivcha gets to go free, and that's why he didn't want to take her back. And then the Gemara says, "Ushmuel lo mibaya de ishtabude lo mishtabe ba elagita de cherusa nami lo atzrecha." That not only did Shmuel not treat her like a Shivcha, he treated her like a full-blown Jewess. But furthermore, he did not even feel it necessary to write her a writ of emancipation. And Shmuel l'taimei dorma Shmuel hamafkir avdo yatsa lecherus. And Shmuel is consistent because he paskins that if a person declares his evet to be hefker, that in itself obviates the need for a writ of emancipation. The evet goes free automatically. And how do we know this? V'chol evet ish miknas kesef. The Torah talks about the Korban Pesach, and it says that if you own a slave that is an Eved Ish, the slave of a man, then you shall circumcise him, and then he can partake of the Korban Pesach. We just read about it in last week's Parsha. So the Gemara's question is, Eved Ish v'lo Eved Isha? What does that mean, Eved Ish? That's not normally how the Torah speaks. It should have said, V'chol Eved. What do you mean? He's the slave of a man and not the slave of a woman? That doesn't make any sense. Ela eved sheyesh lo reshus l'rabol of kori eved, she'en lo reshus l'rabol of ein kori eved. Rather, what the Torah is telling you is that by default, if I no longer have the ability to work my servant because I've declared him hefker, then he automatically goes free. And that's why Shmuel understood that a get shichror is not necessary. Another story. Amosei de Rabbi Abba bar Zutra ishtaboy, Parka hahu tarmuda l'shum itza. So Rabbi Abba must have had a very attractive shivcha. She gets taken captive, and then a certain tarmuda, a Gentile, ransoms her and wants to keep her for himself. Now this is a terrible situation. She's a shivcha Kananis. We want to get her back home and either have her remain as a shivcha for Rabbi Abba, or emancipate her so that she becomes a Jewess, but not that she should become the wife of this Gentile. So shalchu leili didei iyeyus avdus shadar lagita de cherusa. So the Rabbi Abba's friends sent a message to him saying as follows: if you want to do the right thing, you should be meshachrer, you should free this girl and write her a get shichrur. So the Gemara says, hey chidami, why did they say that? Like, what's the case? Ida matzu parkila lama ligita de cherusa. If they figured that they could raise the money to buy her back from this tarmuda Gentile, why didn't they just raise the money and pay for her ransom and not require Rabbi Abba to free her? And idalo matzu parkila kishada lagita de cherusa mai havi. And if they're not able to get her out of the possession of this Gentile man, then what's the point of freeing her? She's under the thumbnail of a Gentile. What does that help in any way? So la'olam dematzu parkila, the kaven de meshadr lagita de cherusa chiburi mechabri adadi parkila. So the Gemara answers, you know what we're talking about? They had the ability to buy her back, to buy her freedom back from this tarmuda man. The only problem is that they were of the opinion that there's no mitzvah of pidyon shvuyim, like we learned in the Chachamim yesterday. There's no mitzvah of pidyon shvuyim for an Eved Kanani. There's only a mitzvah of pidyon shvuyim for a Jew. And the concern is that if she's going to remain a shivcha Kananis, we're not going to be able to raise the capital to free her, because everyone's going to think there's no mitzvah of pidyon shvuyim. They're not going to contribute. But once you free her, we'll be able to tell everyone we have a Jewess in captivity. Now let's all do the mitzvah of pidyon shvuyim. That was their thinking. V'ibayis ema. I'll give you another explanation. Says the Gemara. La'olam delo matzu parkila. Really, they weren't able to free her. V'keven de meshadra lagita de cherusa mitzala be'ape umafrikla. But their strategy was this. They said, you know what we're going to do? Let's publicly make an issue of the fact that she's a shivcha. And how are we going to do that? We'll ask Rabbi Abba to send a writ of emancipation that will become public knowledge. And once it becomes public knowledge that this girl was previously a slave, this Tarmuda, a man, is not going to want to have anything to do with her anymore. It's going to be degrading to him to say that I'm making a big wedding in my Gentile community, marrying a woman who was a former slave. And that was the reason why they told Rabbi Abba, write a writ of emancipation so that we'll be able to buy her back, that the Tarmuda, a man, will be able to release her. So, because otherwise they didn't feel that they would be able to. So, frek the Gemara v'ha'amar mar chaviva lahen behemten shel Yisrael yoser min shosein. Now, this is a very derogatory statement. It's a Gemara in the Avodah Zarah that says, why would that be an objection? Why would any Gentile not want to consort with a woman who was previously a slave to a Jew? Our sages tell us that a Gentile heathen, an idolater, would rather consort with an animal that is owned by a Jew than his own wife. Now, what that means, we're going to leave that aside for a minute, okay? Because it's a very bizarre statement for Chazal to make. But they say it, and it has to be understood properly. But the point is certainly over here, why would the heathen, this Tarmuda, a man, why would he be embarrassed to marry this girl just because she had been previously a Hebrew slave? Isn't it prestigious for them to say that they had some association with Jews? You know, if it's good enough for Bill Clinton's daughter, why isn't it enough for this Tarmuda, a man, right? Or Donald Trump's daughter, right? So anyway, so the Gemara answers, Hani mili bitsina aval bifarhesia zila buhu milsa. The Gemara says, really, it's only a reflection, this statement by Chazal, that they'd rather consort with the animals of a Jew, right, is a statement as far as what they'd like to do in private. But publicly, from a societal level, it is considered still to be degrading or insulting to the family for him to marry a girl who was owned by a Jew previously. So because of the anti-Semitism that is rampant, and also the stigma of marrying a girl who was previously a slave. Let's go on to the next Gemara. Hahi amasa dahavis bepumpadisa dahavukama abdi ba inshi isura. The Gemara says that there was once, again, probably a very attractive shifcha, that apparently the boys, the Bacharim in the community, were having their way with her in a very inappropriate fashion. She was, I don't know, whatever, she was a loose girl, and they wanted to put her under, they wanted to do something to stop this from being a michshol in the community. So Amar Abaye ilavda Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel Kol HaMeshachar Avda over Ba'asei Hava Kaifana Le Lemara the Kasiv Lagita de Shichrura de Cherusa. So he says, Abaye said, if not for Shmuel's Psak, Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel's Psak, that it is usher to free a Canaanite slave, because there's a mitzvah's aseh, which we'll learn about in just a minute, I would have said, let's compel the master to free this girl. She'll become a full-blown Jewess, and a nice boy will marry her, and that will put an end to the problem, right? So Ravina Omar Ki Hamoda Rav Yehuda Mishum Milsa Di Isura. So Rav Yehuda says, what are you talking about? In this situation, even Shmuel would agree that even though there's an Isur in the Torah freeing her, but to avoid other Isurim that are inappropriate, you would have a heter to go ahead and free her. V'abaya Mishum Isura Lo. So the Gemara now says, doesn't Abaye agree with that even though there's an Isser to free her, but in this situation it would be warranted? Look, I'll show you another example, because Amar Rav Chinana bar Rav Ketina Amar Rav Yitzchak Ma'isa v'isha echa shechetz yeshivcha v'chetzya bas chorin v'kafu es rabba v'asa bas chorin. That we know of as another story, that there was once a young lady who was a shivcha, but she was half shivcha, half Jewess. What had happened? We've seen this case before. She had two masters who shared her equally. One of the masters emancipated his half of her, and the other master did not. So half the time she was a shivcha, half the time she was a Jewess. And of course, this is a situation where she can marry nobody. She can't marry an Evet Kanani because of the half of her that's Jewish. She cannot marry a Jew because of the half of her that's a Shivcha Kananis. So what do? So they coerced the guy who still retained half of his ownership of her to emancipate her. Ba'amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak min av hefker nahaguba. And the reason, said Rav Nachman, is because they were treating her in a very loose fashion, because everyone knew that this girl has no solution, she can't get married, so we might as well have our way with her in a very inappropriate thing. Right, so doesn't Abai agree that in that situation we can coerce someone to emancipate the slave? So the Gemara answers, well, it's different over there, because Hachi hashta hasam lo le'eved chazia velo leben chorin chazia. Hacha efshir demiache lo la'avdei umintar la. Abayi's argument is this. He says, in the situation where she was half and half, she really can't marry anyone halachically, and therefore there's no other option to prevent her behavior with the other boys unless we have her master, the other guy, emancipate her as well. But in our situation where she's a full-fledged shifcha kenanis, all we have to do, we can solve the problem without emancipating her. Just have her master find an Eved Kanani who will agree to be her full-time consort, will be her full-time domestic partner, and as a result, he'll watch over her and make sure that the other people in the neighborhood don't abuse and get involved in anything lewd with her. So that's why Abaye said, on that basis, since there's another viable solution, we do not give you a heter to free her, because the Torah says you're not allowed to free an Eved Kanani.
You're away the word husband.
I didn't use the word husband because it's questionable whether there is such a term of husbandry with avodim. Really, what you do is you assign to her a domestic partner, right? Amar Gufa. So let's go back to that statement of Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel Kol Hameshacher Abda Oiver Ba'asei Shenamar La'olam Bahem Ta'avodu. So what is the basis for saying that if you free a Canaanite slave, you violate a mitzvahs aseh, a positive commandment in the Torah? Because the Torah says you shall subjugate them. Now who is them? The Torah is talking about the nations that you confront when you enter into Eretz Yisrael. And Rashi just points out it seems to be a contradictory thing. I mean, on the one hand, the Torah says that you have to drive out all of the indigenous Canaanite tribes when you inherit the land of Eretz Yisrael. How then can the Torah say, treat them as your slaves? You can't have them living with you. So the Gemara explains that pasuk is talking about a descendant of a Canaanite, where the mother is a Canaanite and the father is from another Gentile land from outside of Eretz Canaan, outside from Eretz Yisrael. Those are the people that the Torah is addressing when it says that you're allowed to have them as a slave. And so it's a machlokes. Does it mean that you're allowed to have them as a slave? Or does it mean that if you have them as a slave, you're not permitted to liberate them? That's two ways of looking at the pasuk. So Meisvei Maisa B'Rebbe Eliezer Shenichnas B'Veis HaKnesses V'lo Matza Asara V'Shichar Avdo V'Shlimu La'asara. So the Gemara says, but let's raise a contradiction. If you're telling me that the way you look at the pasuk is that you have to keep them as a slave, how could Rebbe Eliezer do what he did? He came once to shul and found that there were only 9 guys, and he had his evidence, so he emancipated his Eved to make him into a Jew. I mean, talk about commitment to Tefillah B'Tzibur. That's pretty impressive, right? So, and this is an irreversible process. He can't do this a second time. The guy is now free. So what right did he have to free the Eved? So the Gemara answers mitzvah shiny. And there's a lot of discussion about what this answer means. But for the sake of a mitzvah, right, we do allow you to emancipate it. The Torah only forbids you to emancipate him when there's no productive mitzvah to be accomplished through his emancipation. But if through freeing him you can do a mitzvah, that's different. Tana Rabbana. La'olam bahem ta'avodu rishus divi Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Akiva, Omer Choyva. So here's where the Brisa says you see this machlokas Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Shmuel says that the Torah is not obligating you to keep him as a slave. It's telling you that you have permission to keep him as a slave even though his mother is a Canaanite. And Rabbi Akiva says, no, the Torah is telling you that you're obligated. Once you've made him into a slave, you're not allowed to free him. So the Gemara says, well, now that you see that there's a machlokas tanoim, v'dilma Rabbi Eliezer sabar lakamanda amar rishus, then why do you have to say that the reason why Rabbi Eliezer freed him to make the minion because he was doing a mitzvah? That's different. You don't have to come on to that answer. Just say very simply, Rabbi Eliezer holds like Rabbi Yishmael, who says that it's not obligatory. So the Gemara says, Lo salka daitach detanya behedja Rabbi Eliezer omer choiva. You would never think that because we have a brisa that quotes Rabbi Eliezer himself saying that you have an obligation to not free them. Amar Rabba bahani tlas mili nachdi balibatim inichsehon. There are 3 inappropriate things that balabatim do which as a punishment from heaven causes them to lose their fortunes. What are they? Demafki avdai lecherusa. Number one, they incorrectly emancipate their Canaanite slaves, like Rabbi Akiva had said. Number two, udesari nichsayu b'shabta. They examine their business activities on Shabbos, meaning that they'll go out to the factory and take a look at it, even though they're not doing any malacha. But the Torah says v'daber davar, that the Navi rather says v'daber davar, which teaches us that you're not allowed to talk about business on Shabbos. You're not allowed to inspect and read business things on Shabbos, and that's why they lose their fortunes, because they disrespect Shabbos by doing those things. And the third thing is utekavoy udasayu b'shabta be'eden be medrasha. And they also, the third thing they do is wrong, is they make a meal and start eating while the Rav is giving his drasha.
Unbelievable.
Kiddush clubs, you guys are in trouble.
You guys.
No, don't mean you guys. You guys in Jeanette. What? No one here goes to Kiddush club. Okay, good. The Amar Reb Chia bar Abba, Amar Reb Yechanan. Listen, if you want to be a rich man, stay in for the Rav's drasha. The Amar Reb Chia bar Abba, Amar Reb Yechanan. Shtei mishpachas hayu b'Yerushalayim, echas kavas udasa b'shabta, ve'echas kavas udasa be'erev Shabbos, u'shteya ne'ekaru. Because we actually have a testimony about this. Rabbi Yochanan says there were two wealthy families in Yerushalayim. One of those families used to make their meal during the Rav's drasha. Another family, I'll learn like the second pshat in Rashi, is that they were so wealthy they had a very big meal every day. And they did this even on Friday, so that by the time Shabbos came, they weren't hungry anymore. So this was also a degradation of the honor of Shabbos. And these two families, both because they disrespected Shabbos or the Rav's drasha in some way, lost their fortunes. Amar Rabba, Amar Rav, Hamakdish Avdo Yetzel Lecher. So now the last sugya that we're going to deal with today is if a person who declares his Eved to be Hektish. If a man declares his Eved Kanani to be Hektish, this is tantamount to him saying, I hereby make you into a Jew. I hereby emancipate you. My taima, Gufe la Kadosh la Demelo Ka'amar, Delihave Am Kadosh Ka'amar. The answer is like this. Normally, you see now, let's think about this for a second. The only thing that could become intrinsically hektish, if I declare something hektish, then it has to be an object or a material that can either be used for bedek habayis, that can be used for building improvements in the temple, or it can be used as a korban. But let's say it cannot be used as a building material or as a korban, then normally I interpret what I mean is when I make something hektish, like I take a pig and I say this pig is hektish, right? I obviously don't mean that it's going to be used as a building material. I don't mean for it to be used as a korban. So what do I mean? I mean for its value. I hereby pledge the pig's value to the temple, and I owe the temple $50 for the value of the pig, right? Now, what happens if I do the same thing with the Eved Kanani? The Eved cannot be used as building material. He cannot be used as a korban. But in this situation, since you didn't say explicitly, lidimei, I hereby pledge the value of this Eved to the temple, there's an alternate way of interpreting his statement which makes more sense, which means that when I said he's kadosh, what I mean to say is he's going to be part of the holy nation. And that in itself is a declaration of his emancipation. And that's why he goes free, says Rav. So the Gemara now says, V'Rav Yosef Amar Rav, Hamafkir Avdo Yatzel Lecheres. Rav Yosef quotes Rav as saying a different statement, which is that if you declare your Eved Hefker, he also immediately goes free, like we saw before, like Shmuel had said, right? So, Mando Amar Makdish Kol Shekein Mafkir, Mando Amar Mafkir Avol Makdish Lo Dimala Demei Ka Amar. Now, if you hold like Rav Yosef, that Rav just said to make him Hefker, that doesn't necessarily mean that you'll agree that if you say he's hektish, that he also goes free, because maybe according to Rav Yosef, all that means is that you're pledging his value, like we said by the pig. But if you learn that declaring him hektish makes him go free, then surely declaring him hefker makes him go free. Now, now the question is, once you declare him to be hefker or you declare him to be hektish, do you have to also write him a get shichur, or writ of emancipation, or not? Now, we had seen that Shmuel held that you don't have to, but the Gemara is asking this question, sort of basically saying, do we paskin like Shmuel or not? So, Tashma da'amar Reb Chia bar Abin Amar Rav, echad zeh ve'echad zeh yatzel lecherus v'tzarech get shichur, or yetzel lecherus. That Rav is quoted as saying that in both situations, whether you're makdish or whether you're mafkir, the Eved goes free, but unlike Shmuel, you do have to write a get shichur nonetheless. Amar Rabba umosfinan ashmaite. So now we have Rav's statement that if you declare him to be hektish, he goes free. But now let's bring it to Yufta. Let's bring a brisa that seems to disagree with that. Hamakdish nechasav. If a person sanctifies all of his assets, he says, all of what I own is hektish. V'hayu bahen avadim, ena gizbor mishoim lahotzian lecherus, aval mochrin osan la'acherim, v'acherin motzian osan lecherus. So the treasurers of the temple who take possession of all of this man's assets do not have a right to just willy-nilly emancipate the slaves, because after all, that is an irresponsible act of hektish. Their duty as treasurers of the temple is to get the best financial value, right, for what has been given to them. So therefore, they don't have a right to declare those avadim free, but what they can do is they can sell them to other people, and if those people, once the temple has gotten its value for the avadim, then those other people can make them free. And Rebbe Omer Ani Afu Nosein Demei Atzmo V'Yotze Mipnei Shehu Kemochrolo. And Rebbe says, I'll go even further. If someone were to give that Eved Kanani cash that is worth his value, he himself could purchase himself from the Beis HaMikdash, and he could go free, and that would be perfectly fine. We'll get to that later. That's not the main issue of this machlokas. But the question that we're asking from here is that it seems that if you're makdish, if you declare your Eved to be hektish, Itaka becomes the property of the temple, not what you Rav were suggesting, that he just goes and becomes a free man and it's got nothing to do with hektish. So masnisa karamis alei de Rav Tana hu polik. So the Gemara says it's not a contradiction, because Rav has every right to argue with a Mishnah if he wants to. Rav has the power of being a Tana. We see this many times in Shas when Rav is confronted with a Mishnah or Brisa that contradicts him. The Gemara sometimes will say that Rav has a right to disagree. Tashma. But let's look at another brisa. Ach kol cherem v'goymer. The Torah says that anything that you dedicate to the temple, may adam uvehema, that even if it's a human being or an animal. So the Gemara now says, the brisa says, may adam elu avada v'shivchos v'hakanani. The word adam refers to the fact that a person can declare hektish his servants, his slaves. So again, it's a kasha on Rav. You see that if you declare your Eved hektish, it's not a declaration of freedom, it's a declaration of that he belongs to the temple. So hacha b'mayaskinan da'amar l'demei. So the Gemara says that's not a problem. That brisa says that the meaning of the pasuk is where you say, I hereby pledge the value of my Eved to the temple. That's what the pasuk means. So when you say it explicitly in that way, then we know that you're not freeing the slave, you're just making a pledge to hektish. So frak the Gemara, ihachi idach nami da'amar l'demei. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, then why didn't we interpret the previous Mishnah, where a person pledges all of his assets to the temple, is where he said, l'demei, I hereby pledge the value of all my assets, including my slaves. So the Gemara says that you can't interpret it that way, because over there he says, ihachi ein ha-gizborim rishayim lahotzian lecherus, gizborim ayavidatayu. If a person made the pledge in that fashion, where really he's only pledging a monetary debt to the temple, then how could the Gizborim take possession of the slaves to even think to emancipate them? So obviously that Mishnah over there is not talking about that case. And Vesu, and furthermore, what right does the treasurers have to sell them to other people, and those other people now can emancipate them? The Eved still is the property of the pledger. So how that can't possibly be. Vesu Rebbe Omer ani afu nosin demei atzma v'yotz mibnei shu kemochrolo v'ila demei my mibnei shu kemochrolo. And furthermore, how could the Gizborim take the money from the Eved to emancipate himself? The Gizborim have no rights over him. The Eved has no rights to have that money, because immediately if anyone gives him the money, he's still the possession of his master. So the whole process, this whole Mishnah does not work if we're talking about a person who's only pledging the value of the slave. The latter brisa, we could explain it that way, but the first brisa seems to be directly contradictory to Rav, and that's why the only way that we could get out of it was by saying Rav Tana hu upolig. Now Tashma, let's look at the next brisa, and with this we'll finish for today. Hamakdish avdo oisa v'oichel shelo hikdish eladamav. If a person makes hektish his eved, the eved still works for him, and the eved still eats from the master's pantry. And the reason is because this was only a pledge to hektish for the eved's value, but the eved still belongs to the master. Again, a contradiction to Rab, because here you just said hektish. You didn't say I make him hektish l'demei. I'm not pledging. You didn't say I pledge his value. You just said I make him hektish. So, and Rab says in that situation the eved goes free. It's got nothing to do with hektish. So Hamani Rabbi Meir he the Amar in Adamotzi Devara Levatala. The Gemara says it's a machlokes tanoim. That brisa or that mishnah goes like Rabbi Meir, who says that when it comes to declarations of hektish, we don't reinterpret a person to mean something that means anything other than hektish. Rabbi Meir says that if a person says hektish, he means it to be hektish, and if there's something nonsensical in that statement that can't work, we reinterpret it until it works. And therefore, even though the person didn't say Avdi hektish l'demei, my slave's value is hektish, he rather said my slave is hektish, we reinterpret that to mean that I hereby pledge my slave's value to hektish. And that's only according to Reb Meir. Rab says no. When you say my slave is hektish, the Chachamim would understand that to mean that that's a nonsensical statement, and therefore the only way to understand it is to mean that he goes free as a Jew. Now, Hachanami Mistav, the Gemara says that seems to be the way you have to understand that brisa, because that it goes like Reb Meir. He says the Ketani Seifa v'chein hu shehiktish atzmo osa v'ochel shelo hiktish eladamav. And because the brisa continues by saying that if a man, forget about his slave, let's say he says about himself, I hereby make myself hektish. Now, that doesn't mean that the man can't work anymore and he can't do anything because he now belongs to the temple. Of course he still belongs to himself, because what that means is, we interpret what that means is that he's pledging the value that he would fetch if he were a slave to be sold on the slave market. That's what he means to pledge when he says, I hereby make myself hektish. So, Iyamart Bishlam Reb Meir hu Shapir. So, of course, we have to reinterpret it, and that's what Reb Meir says. Anytime a person uses hektish, reinterpret his words to the benefit of hektish until his words work. But Ela Iyamart Rabbanon hi Bishlam Avda l'demei koi Ela Ihu l'demei koi. She says, but if you're going to learn like the Chachamim, who are more rigid in their interpretation of a person's statements, it's one thing to say that the Chachamim would agree that you can pledge an eved, and when you pledge an eved, you mean his value. But when a person says, I hereby make myself hektish, how can you say, according to the Chachamim, that you reinterpret that to mean his value? A man who is a free man doesn't have an intrinsic value on the slave market. Unless you say explicitly, I hereby pledge the value that I would fetch on the slave market if I were a slave, that's what I want to pledge to the temple. That's a lot to reinterpret according to the Chachamim, because a normal free man is not a financial commodity. And therefore you have to say from the Seifa that we go like Rabbi Meir, who basically says you do everything that you can to reinterpret what the guy is saying until it makes sense to the benefit of hektish. And therefore that sort of proves that this Mishnah, or this Brisa, really is going according to Rabbi Meir, not according to the Chachamim. And Rab is going according to the Chachamim, who say that no, interpret it as directly as you can, even if it's not to the benefit of hektish, which is why Rab says that the eved goes free, because what you mean to say when you say he's hektish is that he becomes a Jewish free man. Have a wonderful